Greetings, Zero Book readers. Today, I'll be bringing to you an interview with Dr. Joshua Moufawad-Paul, the highly accomplished author of 6 books on Marxist philosophy from a Maoist perspective. 3 of these books, Continuity and Rupture, Methods Devour Themselves, and Demarcation and Demystification, were published by Zer0 Books, and Josh has kindly agreed to speak with us about them. All of Josh's books to date can be viewed as forming a systematic whole, beginning with his 2014 polemic, The Communist Necessity, which argued for the need to renew our understandings of communism and the party, retrieving them from the politically impotent grasps of movementism, horizontalism, and other similar counter-revolutionary maladies. This renewal, Josh argues, was delivered by the development of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism in 1988. Josh, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us about your work.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So in the introduction to your latest book, The Critique of Maoist Reason, published with Foreign Language Press, you write that, in many ways, my work to date is more accurately a critique of Maoist reason. Could you possibly talk us through your intellectual political trajectory and how it brought you to Maoism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long political trajectory, so I'll try to just give generalities instead of complete details, because we could be here for, I could write a whole, 50 pages on this. But
Please be my guest, talk as much as you want.
So, I was politicized halfway through my undergrad in kind of that burgeoning anti-globalization movement, because this is keep in mind, this is, the mid to late 90s for me. Before that, I was generally progressive. I came from a social democrat Christian family. I mean, they're Christian, but they still have that kind of social democrat kind of view of things. And I had access to some radical literature. And I read the Communist Manifesto and other classics in high school mainly because it seemed edgy at the time. This is the period, you got to keep in mind, in high school, it's just the Cold War had just ended. So I'd grown up before that with, all of this, anti-communist, Cold War propaganda. And so just, reading that stuff in high school was like, oh, I'm being edgy reading this communist stuff. But really, aside from some personal experiences that probably helped with my later politicization, at that point, I wasn't really political. But, at the end of the second year of my undergrad, I started hanging out with the campus activists, one of whom would eventually become my wife years later. And it's actually her, my wife, Vicky, years before she was my wife, the same friend group, who radicalized me into being an anti-capitalist and an anti-imperialist. I remember having a lot of arguments and discussions with her that were really formative to my political education, my early political education. But at that point of time, anarchism was the dominant ideological trend in university and amongst the general activist groupings. Again, this was the late 90s. And as I mentioned, I'd grown up, witnessing all this, the fall of the Soviet bloc and being fed a diet of anti-communist propaganda since I was really little. So the anti-globalization movement with this kind of anarchist ideology was the order of the day. And at the high point of that was, in 2001, in the spring of 2001, I went to Quebec City with my affinity group to protest the Free Trade Area of the Americas Summit. And that's kind of where I really got to see it firsthand, what the police were actually about. I experienced, police violence, tear gassing and all that. So, that kind of really taught me what confrontation with the state was, but it was still in that kind of and there was all this kind of optimism about the anti-globalization movement, but that was kind of where we were at. And I wrote about that in The Communist Necessity and that kind of background of movementism. Anyways, I started my MA in philosophy in 2001. I'm kind of dealing with this kind of my political trajectory with looking at kind of two things, my activist kind of trajectory and my academic trajectory, which got all intermingled a lot. So I started my MA in philosophy in 2001 and decided to focus on political philosophy because of my activism. And that meant that I started studying a bunch of Marxist-influenced philosophy and post-structuralist philosophy. This is aside from, the steady diet of liberal political philosophy that was just standard and you had to do as well. But I was, investigating this kind of Marxist and post-structuralist stuff. At that time, I was more drawn to this kind of post-Marxist, post-structuralist kind of thing because that kind of seemed to, connect to my anarchism. But eventually, I moved away from that. I'll talk about that a bit later. But it's that time when I started my MA in philosophy that the World Trade Center bombing of September 11th happened. Right? It's kind of the beginning of my MA. I remember sitting in the grad pub and seeing it happen on TV, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my activism because a lot of us that were in that anti-globalization activist circles, we started to reorient ourselves into the anti-war movement. So during this time, my MA thesis advisor, who was a Marxist philosopher, it was Jeff Noonan at the University of Windsor, he was challenging me on my anarchism. And after a number of exchanges, I ended up gravitating more towards Marxism. But the way I kind of got into it is I gravitated towards Marxism through kind of autonomous Marxism. And one of the books that was, kind of foundational for me there was Nick Dyer-Witherford's Cyber Marx. And that seemed to explain things better than the anarchist theory I had been focused on up to that point. It convinced me to really study Marx and Engels. And so, like, seriously, outside of like my university requirements, so I was like reading the classics, going back to read the classics of Marx and Engels. And along with that, because I'd read Dyer-Witherford's book, I started reading all this stuff in the autonomous tradition, like Tronti and Negri and all those folks. And I also at that point got into Deleuze and Guattari, who seemed to be these kind of philosophical expressions of autonomism too. I mean, as you know, Guattari like co-wrote things with Negri, so yeah. Communists Like Us, right, which is a book I really loved in my MA. So that was that kind of MA period. And then I moved to Toronto to reunite with Vicky, who I actually got married with her in the summer before I moved to do my PhD. And I moved to Toronto with her. She was doing her MFA. I did my PhD there, and we got involved with the milieu of anti-capitalist activists in Toronto. And this was the height of the anti-war movement. I already mentioned how it kind of reoriented towards that. But even though we were involved in that, there was in Toronto at that time a burgeoning Palestinian solidarity movement that we were part of. There was a radical labor movement and a radical anti-poverty movement. And these circles, they all kind of intersected in that general movementist way. And we kind of had that notion that we'd have we were all part of a bunch of small movements where we all knew each other and of the other groups. And we worked on our issues in collaboration with other issues with this kind of optimism that we were contributing to a critical mass, which is the same spirit as the anti-globalization movement, but kind of, moved into these other circles as well. During this time, my politics began to develop further based on my experiences and the need to read work that could account for these experiences. So, doing work for Palestinian solidarity and then moving into radical labor organizing in connection with that kind of Palestinian solidarity and anti-war stuff led to this unique juxtaposition. And I was moved at this time towards the necessity of anti-colonial organizing and recognizing with other friends and comrades that Canada was a settler colonial state. So in the first year of my PhD, I actually was part of a solidarity trip paid for by my union's flying squad to Ganasatagi. And I don't know if your listeners might not know because they're in Britain and everywhere else, but in Canada, Ganasatagi it's this, indigenous, reserve, right? It's for where the kind of Iroquois Mohawk are in one of the areas where they are in Canada. Okay. But it has this radical history because back in 1990, there was a standoff between Mohawk warriors and the Canadian Army, largely over the fact that the settler town of Oka wanted to expand its 9-hole golf course into an 18-hole golf course onto indigenous land, which would mean completely excavating and destroying the Ganasatagi's community cemetery. And so, barricades went up, all this stuff happened, and they actually succeeded in getting the town to back off and kind of the army to back off as well. But this time when I went up, it was the Mohawk warriors had put up the blockades again years after their standoff with the Canadian Army because there was a corrupt puppet police chief that they were trying to oust out of the community. And they called for solidarity from different people to come and stand on the barricades with them. So I went, and that was really politically important for me because it kind of showed me anti-colonial resistance, the need for solidarity with colonized people in Canada, and also showed me the colonial reality of Canada and the way that these colonial zones are set up in relation to the settler zones. So during all of this, along with others, because of these experiences, myself and my wife and all of our kind of activist close friends, we were reading classic anti-imperialist and anti-colonial literature. Outside of the philosophy I had to study as part of my job as a doctorate student and more foundational works by Marx and Engels, I was getting into Frantz Fanon and Samir Min and others. At this point, my autonomous Marxism was a bit stretched. So I started to move to the classic revolutionary Marxist tradition. Finally reading Lenin was eye-opening. Right? It gave me a theoretical clarity I felt was missing. And it's like, in academic programs of philosophy specifically, Lenin's not taught, right? So it's just kind of something, but I've taught now and I've put Lenin on syllabuses and I'm sure other people have, but at the time that was something that was like, oh, it's this Lenin guy's.
I've actually seen Lenin taught a couple times on Berkeley on philosophy courses from materialism and imperial criticism.
Yeah, well, I think that represents a general shift a lot of people like myself went through to see like why is this stuff not on there anymore. So we started wanting to add it. Even I know people who've added it who don't necessarily agree with Lenin, but still think he's such a clear writer that he should be included in the canon. But because of that whole history of like anti-Soviet, anti-communist propaganda for a long time, teaching Lenin in academia was like considered something that wasn't cool or wasn't nifty or whatever, right? In any case, from reading Lenin, I moved towards Mao, partially because at the same time, I was beginning to encounter a number of Maoists. And when I say a number of Maoists, I'm not talking about hobby first world Maoists, the kind that now you see on social media arguing and calling each other revisionist and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about like folks that were connected to struggles in the global periphery, some of whom were living in exile. Right. So one of my best friends at the time was an Afghan Maoist, right? And he introduced me to the history of the revolutionary internationalist movement. And at this time, the People's War in Nepal was at its height. So we were paying attention to that. And from that connection, I also learned about the Philippines and India. So all of this is, a roundabout way to say that eventually, through my activism and rigorous study, I found that the Maoist critique better answered the questions I was investigating than any other theory was doing it for me, right? And this Maoist critique, for me, could better explain all the phenomena of my own political experience than anything else. It provided a clear and coherent framework. It demystified social phenomena in the way that I was like looking for. So when I began publishing years after coming to this conclusion, after having completed my doctorate and having worked as an organizer, and by then what I call my critique of Maoist reason was an attempt to rigorously examine Maoism as a theoretical terrain with all of its contributions and internal line struggles. And I guess that pretty much sums up my trajectory to date.
Right. Well, there's a lot to pick up on there. You said some really interesting things. Firstly, like something I struggle a lot with as both an activist and an academic as well is finding a way to balance and intertwine those two. But something I've noticed a lot and that I've heard from a lot of professors in philosophy is this general idea of a resurgence of Marxism, that it's finally appearing again in conversation. Some of the Cold War superstition surrounding it seems to have faded away. Any ideas why that's happened from an insider's perspective?
Well, I think maybe it shows the waning strength of that kind of anti-communist propaganda, and the fact that when you start dealing with the scholarship of it, and when people actually are scholars, not even just Marxist scholars, but liberal scholars too, who studied the history of the Soviet Union and China, it begins to look very different than the stories that were depicted in Cold War propaganda. So there's been a lot of work that's been done. But I also think there are people, if they're politically committed and they ended up in academia to study these kinds of things, they may have had a similar trajectory to me, or may have experienced this kind of a period where they were fed a certain line about communism, and now living through this nightmare of capitalism and seeing that its claim to be the end of history and make anything better is just a bunch of garbage, have gone back and started critically looking at a lot of this old work. And also just maybe because the anti-globalization movement put people in touch with people around the globe, that you started realizing that, there's Marxist movements around the globe in the third world that never bought into this anti-communist propaganda. And so I think that might be part of it. It's hard to say how this phenomena happens, but maybe there's just a bunch of people like me who've had a similar trajectory who are now teaching and have a bit more critical awareness.
And we're all the better for it. I want to ask you along those lines about something you said earlier about how engaging with anti-colonialism and anti-colonial literature was what pulled you away from autonomism, because that's something I feel a lot. Formally, I associate myself with autonomous Marxism. I used to be a member of Plan C, and that's the organization that Mark Fisher was a member of. And I'm still a big fan of Angry Workers. I think they do some fantastic work. But it seems like there's this strategic perspective that they've started off with taking. Steve Wright talks a bit about this in Storming Heaven, where the notion of anti-capitalist resistance is organized around locating where the labor movement is the strongest, rather than where the links in capitalism's chain are the weakest. So these anti-colonial worries around autonomism are something that are on my mind a lot. In my eyes, at least, it seems like the successful anti-capitalist movements around today aren't the ones that do one or the other, where there's a strong labor movement or there are weaknesses in the supply chain, but where both are combined somehow,
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I really felt, there's examples from autonomism that might like undermine kind of anti-colonial work or anti-colonial theory, as there is in any theory. I didn't really feel that it was antagonistic towards it. I just felt that it wasn't answering the questions I wanted answered, right? Or was providing poor answers for them with the theory that existed. I mean, originally it was more that, okay, well, I should, extend an autonomist analysis, since I really liked that stuff at that time, to, dovetail with Frantz Fanon and all this other stuff I was reading. But it's also more that when I started reading all of this other stuff, which was connected more to some kind of Marxist-Leninist framework, a lot of it was right at the time, it just drew me more towards that tradition. And like, I also, like, maybe an early like prefiguration of this for me was, in my MA, the beginning of my MA, Empire came out, right? Mm-hmm. And since I was getting into autonomism at that time and I was reading the classics, I was like, oh, I'm going to read Empire, right? And I was like, I found that whole Empire thesis just not very good, right? It even seemed to like even with Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, they had an understanding of center and peripheries, and they even like cited Samir Amin. So, I mean, and Empire was this whole notion of the Empire thesis. It really seemed to be an attempt to say that the anti-globalization analysis that we'd had was correct when suddenly, the attack on the World Trade Center had happened. They wrote it right before that. But when that happened, mm-hmm. there was, it kind of was like, well, wait, no, imperialism still exists. It's not this thing of empire, right? There are imperialist metropoles. This distinction between the center and the periphery matters. And so I was like, I need a better analysis than what's appearing in Negri and Hart's book, right? And so that's what drew me towards Samir Amin. And then I think all of that stuff all together, as I pointed out, when I started reading Lenin and all this other stuff, it just better conceptualize things for me. But that doesn't mean I still have like this love of autonomous literature, because it was my gateway drug into Marxism.
I feel like it's that way for a lot of people. That's more or less how I got into it. I mean, very much like yourself, actually. My first encounter with Marxism was back in high school. Or in middle school even. I won a history prize in my department or something. And the prize was I could pick a single book off the shelf of the history department and take it home with me. So I saw the Communist Manifesto, picked it up off the bookshelf. And the head of the history department looked at me bemusedly and went, Karl Marx corrupting young minds. But yeah, like I first encountered autonomism in my first year of university. Everyone, it seemed like, was going around reading Storming Heaven and like Mario Tronti and all of these other people. So yeah, I think you and I have a fairly similar trajectory in that respect. If you don't mind, let's get on to talking about one of your books. So I have a couple of them here. But this is the one I really want to start off with, Continuity and Rupture. If I'm understanding it correctly, it revolves mainly around these 5 central theses that you'll lay out right near the beginning. These are the distinction between Mao Zedong thought and Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the emergence of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism in 1988 by Peru's Chairman Gonzalo, the scientificity of historical materialism, the continuity and rupture of Maoism with Marxism, Leninism, and the limitations of Marxism, Leninism, mostly as like recuperated by Maoism as a historical development of it. Because could you possibly talk us through, for instance, why you think that historical materialism is a science? I think for a lot of contemporary Marxists, that's quite a surprising one. And why you think these theses are important to uphold today.
Yeah, I mean, so the science question, I've written a lot about why we should understand historical materialism as a science. In a number of books, I explain why Marx and Engels understood it themselves as a science and why it's important to take how they understood their own theory, right? Take that seriously. And in an essay for Abstract, I talked about what we lose when we don't understand it as such. And a lot of this was, as you kind of mentioned right here, a response to the fact that such a notion was treated as antiquated by contemporary academic Marxists. And so I was kind of responding to what I felt was like a ban on talking about the theory in the way that Marx and Engels and the revolutionary tradition understood it. And it's like, if Marx and Engels and the revolutionary tradition understood it in a certain way, shouldn't we try to investigate that instead of being, oh, that's so antiquated or something, right? So I don't want to get into a lot of detail here as to why I think we should take the classical Marxist claim about science seriously, since I've done it elsewhere. And again, that's like a book level, but I'll say a few points, right, to get us kind of get people understanding why I said that, right? So science is about demystifying by examining natural phenomena according to natural causes. Historical materialism is the only theory that demystifies social historical phenomena according to social historical causes. And I make a number of arguments as to why this is the case. And it does so through a rigorous process that is the laboratory of class struggle, which can, and I raise this against Karl Popper's claims to the contrary, because he talked about falsification and said Marxism doesn't do this because he was an anti-Marxist. But I said, actually, it does have this built into it through this kind of notion of class struggle. And this is how we get the trajectory of theoretical development that moves towards Maoism. And I brought in more philosophy of science to talk about this and discussed it in relation to Kuhn's notion of paradigm shifts and Bachelard's notion of epistemic ruptures. And, conceptualizing what counts as a science has been part of philosophy for a long time. I mean, I make that joke elsewhere that, like, if you're in a class that is talking about what big science is science, you're likely in a philosophy class and not in a science class, because the scientists, they just do that. They do the science, right?
Yeah.
In any case, historical materialism holds up, in my opinion, as a particular science according to the philosophy of science. And I'll kind of return to that in a way when I talk about these 5 axioms that you talk about later. And it's exactly right. Those 5 axioms kind of formed a general framework of how I wanted to approach the book, right? Because these were axioms that in my mind were established already. And then I used them as a way in to discuss kind of why Maoism as a theoretical terrain was meaningful and salient and a live option. So to go through these, you summarize them too. So I'll just kind of quickly, go over them in a little bit more detail. The first 2 axioms are about how the name Maoism precedes the concept of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. And that is, before the experience of the PCP, the Communist Party of Peru, and the RIM, the Revolutionary Internationalist Movement, the term Maoism was being used as a cipher for a particular type of anti-revisionist Marxism, Leninism in the 1960s and 1970s. And that type of Marxism, Leninism, that was sometimes called Maoism, was meant as a fidelity to Marxism, Leninism against the revisionism of Khrushchev, right? And so people thought that, who were being called Maoists, they saw themselves as kind of anti-revisionist Marxist Leninists who, and the Mao in China at that time were the defenders of Marxism, Leninism against the revisionism of the Soviet Union. And so this got called often Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, right? As opposed to a new stage of revolutionary communism, it was just an anti-revisionist Marxism, Leninism. But it's in the late 80s and early 90s that, despite there were a few prefigurations, but not as big as this, that the PCP and then the RIM proclaimed that Maoism is, like Leninism, another development of historical materialism because of the experience of revolutionary China, and more than simply an anti-revisionist defense of Leninism. For them, it was a stage of the science beyond Leninism. And I felt that was important to explore, right? This claim that's being made, right when we're being told that the end of history has happened because of the fall of the Soviet Union and capitalism is proclaiming itself triumphantly. You get the PCP and then the RIM declaring that, nope, there's a new stage of revolutionary, which is really pushing back against the grain of hegemonic common sense. And the third axiom concerns the above question of science. Right? As I noted, I upheld the notion that historical materialism was a science and Maoism a stage in the science. But I also was careful about how to categorize that, right? Like, I was mindful that there are Marxists who treat materialist dialectics as the queen of the sciences, right? They do that. That's what turns people off to the notion that you can claim that historical materialism is a science, because you got all these wackos that make it seem like it's idealistic nonsense, right? It's like what they're saying is formulas and dogma, and it doesn't sound like science at all. Like, an example I used in the book, and there's so many examples, but this was the one I always found the most funny, was the international Marxist tendencies' ludicrous claim that the Big Bang Theory was wrong because it was somehow undialectical. And it's like, you read that and you're like, what business do these people have to claim they can judge theories of physics on that level? Right? I mean, obviously, historical materialism is such that you can judge the ideology of physicists, right? You can judge their commitment to certain kind of class positions. That's what it's about, right? You can even, it's about, you can look at how you can have a historical materialist analysis of the institution of the sciences and their connection to capitalism. But to suddenly say that, like, a theory like the Big Bang Theory itself is undialectical and that physicists are crazy, then none of these people understand it. It's just bonkers, right? And that's what kind of turns people off to that. So what I wanted to do was structure this axiom to note that historical materialism is a particular science dealing with social historical phenomena. The fourth axiom was about how Maoism is a continuation of Marxism, Leninism, according to the notion of continuity and rupture. And that's where I brought in Kuhn and Bachelard to think how a theoretical terrain can develop in both relation to and a break from its past. Like, how do we conceptualize the development of stages? And this was something important for me to investigate, and it was essential to the book as a whole, right? How does a science remain in continuity with itself and develop discontinuities that are at the same time new continuities, right? These were, of course, terms in the tradition this term like continuity and rupture. You can find those terms in Mao and Lenin as well, in the way that they think about the development of anything, right? And finally, the fifth axiom was about understanding the theoretical limits of Marxism-Leninism. So if we are to understand the necessity of Maoism, then it is also important to understand how that stage was necessitated by Leninism and what limits exist on Marxism-Leninism that is not yet Maoism. Like, what limits did the revolutionary science meet before leading to what we can call Maoism? And so the book as a whole was about thinking through those axioms and their interrelation.
Amazing. Thank you. There's something really interesting at the end of it as well. At the end of the book, you have an appendix, which is a revised of an essay that you previously published called Maoism or Trotskyism. You mentioned the IMT. I've actually spoken to some IMT people. They're weirdly prominent in the UK. I tried asking one of them about the Big Bang thing, and the person was like, I'm a physics student. Obviously, I don't believe that. We're not a party, we're a tendency, so there isn't a party line. And then I went and read Alan Wood's book on it. And it's exactly as weird as you make it sound. He sort of says, like, of course, there are all these various different synchronic or diegetic, like, scientific explanations for why the Big Bang theory has been superseded by other models. But really, once we look at the logic, what's really going on there is it's dialectical materialism. That's it's just such a weird way of understanding scientific development.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because like when the book was published and my former doctoral thesis advisor bought it, really he had read it ahead of time because he wrote a comment on it as well. But he was saying, oh, because of that, the stuff about the IMT you mentioned, he's like, I've gotten a hold of the book, because he was writing stuff on science as well, but he was a Gramscian, but he was looking at he wanted to look at all these bad apprehensions of science by Marxists. And he was like, that's the perfect one. He hadn't known about it, so he grabbed hold of the book.
Well, going to this essay, posed this need to choose between Maoism and Trotskyism. Like, what's the background to that antagonism? And why do you think we need to side with Maoism apart from the Trotskyist, apparently, understanding of science being kind of ludicrous?
Well, I mean, I wrote this because both Trotskyism and Maoism have positioned themselves as the inheritors of the revolutionary communist tradition following Lenin. I mean, there's others as well, but these are the big ones that still cite Lenin, right? And cite themselves as continuing from Lenin. Trotskyism, as you know, was born from Trotsky's failed line struggle with Stalin. And so it tells a narrative about itself as a tradition faithful to Lenin. It's largely a mythology about how every other form of Marxism, Leninism, or anything claiming to develop Leninism further that isn't Trotskyism is actually Stalinism, right? And also that's important to point out that Trotskyism, it is responsible for creating this discourse of Stalinism. And then other tendencies that aren't Trotskyist still use as well, but it's kind of Trotskyism that built this kind of Stalinist discourse. And I'm not saying anything about upholding or attacking Stalin. I'm talking about the discourse that something gets called Stalinism. So hence the point of that polemic was to argue why Maoism is a better inheritor and development of Leninism than Trotskyism is, or ever could be, according to the logic of historical materialism. Trotskyism, like to my mind at least, cannot account for concrete phenomena according to a concrete analysis, except here and there by accident, like it not based on its core kind of theoretical tendencies. And I think this is largely because there has been no revolution directed by Trotskyism, nothing from which to gain a foundation for its theory beyond the story it likes to tell itself about the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin and this great man's story of revolutionary fidelity. In fact, sometimes some ortho-Trotskyists go further. I remember getting in an argument with Sparks years ago, and they went and they claimed that, who was really leading the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't Lenin, it was Trotsky, right? Like they uphold him more than Lenin at some point. Not all do that. I mean, the Sparks are a bit weird, but I mean, it still leads to this kind of, they have this great man story of history where, it's all about this fallout. It's all about, there was Lenin, and then Trotsky was the true inheritor, and then bad Stalin got in the way of that. And so the great man Trotsky has to recuperate his theory somewhere else. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of generally in a nutshell about why I thought we needed to side with Maoism, because I felt, Maoism offered a lot more. It offered a lot more. It could account for the failures of the Soviet Union, or I should say the defeats of the Soviet Union and why it was defeated, why the revolution was defeated there without like going into hagiography. I mean, sometimes Maoists can go into that, but that's what everyone does. And that's the problem, as I talk about, of dogmatism affecting every tendency, right? Mm-hmm. But the actual theory that's generated by it, that was generated by Mao in the course of the Chinese Revolution and then was developed further, actually can explain certain things about the way that party forms ossify, And I know you want to talk about the party later, so I'll leave that off, but produced these kind of tools, these theoretical tools that were more of a story of what went wrong theoretically than stuff about like bad Stalin and socialism in one country and all this kind of stuff that just feels like a complaint between Trotsky and Stalin turned into theory, when really we should be looking at certain theoretical things that are bigger than that, right? And that can be accounted for and understood through these world historical revolutions.
I think I pretty much agree with all that stuff, but it still needs to be, the question still needs to be grappled with, I think, of why in the West, at least, Trotskyism has been so much more popularly successful. I mean, the issues that you mentioned with Trotskyism, I see them all over as well, not just in the IMT and Sparks. Also, a few years ago, I'm not sure if you saw this, there was the SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, made the news in the UK for what's now come to be referred to as the Agent Delta scandal. Have you heard of this?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't really put my finger on it.
The story of it was more or less one of the senior members of the SWP had been sexually harassing younger members, and the other higher ups in the party basically covered it up and protected them in close ranks around the person.
I didn't know what it was called that, but I do remember that followed happening. I remember a lot of people that split from the SWP and started like another tendency for that, including one of my favorite authors at the time, China Mayville.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've seen RS21, Revolutionary Socialism of the 21st Century, at some events and stuff. They seem to be slightly less wacky than the SWP, but they're definitely still there a little bit. But then, Trotskyism has all these problems. I could name the SWP, RS21, IMT. I don't think I could name any Maoist groups in the UK. Why has Trotskyism been so much more influential over here?
Yeah, well, I mean, before I talk about that, I should just finally say that the idea of like kind of sexual assault scandals in organizations is not particular to Trotskyism.
Yeah, that's true.
Coming up of that, it happens in a lot of organizations of all tendencies, because patriarchal relations are a big issue, right? And people can take them and become these terrible people in the way that sometimes parties function. It can cover this up. That's always something that needs to be combated. But I just wanted to put that on the side, because I don't think the SWP is not, alone in this. And we can even go back to stories of different Maoist organizations or pre-Maoist organizations that did the same kind of shit, right?
If I'm not mistaken, the IMT in Canada have just made the news as well for something very similar.
Yeah, the IMT, but we knew that it's like they make it. It's more that the stuff with the IMT actually goes back a lot longer. Where I remember during the last strike I was on, the IMT got involved with it. Their circles in Toronto was called like Fight Back. It's the Canadian one, and they got involved in one of these occupations that a whole bunch of people were a part of. And one woman pointed out that she didn't feel comfortable with them there because she had been like sexually assaulted by leadership by them. And they, instead of like using it as a teaching moment or that, they freaked out. They said it was lies. They came to different union meetings to say we had to stop these lying about their great revolutionary organization. So it really annoyed a union local so much. The union local as a whole, they didn't really care about this thing about Trotskyism or whatever. They voted at a general membership to politically ban the IMT from all union spaces because of this egregious behavior. Anyhow, so yeah, that was years ago, and then now it's coming to light much more after they tried to put a damper on it. But then also like the historical Communist Party of Canada recently had a whole thing about this too. Senior members doing the same kind of thing and then leaving, and so all that stuff is happening. But I mean, I want to get back maybe into, because we could talk about that and not really do it justice. I think it's because it's such a gross thing that happens with organizations that are supposed to be progressive. And again, it's not just the IMT, it's not just the CPC, it's all tendencies may have this problem. I know, like when I was organizing, like I said before, I don't want to get too much detail of my organizing background, but I do know that like there was people in my organizational circles who were expelled or kicked out because of this behavior. Like it would just appear, but thankfully the organizations I worked with took it seriously and expelled these people, right? Just because it's better to do that. But still, it's just a really terrible, shitty thing. But going back to the larger question of Trotskyism as being a larger tendency, well, Trotskyism, including all the sectarian, non-sectarian, and post-Trotskyist variants, it's only a larger tendency now in the West, right? In the kind of the West or the global North.
Yeah.
And I say now too, right? Because during the new communist movement period in the 60s and 70s, proto-Maoist organizations, along with some other anti-revisionist ML organizations or Hojite organizations altogether, they all together formed a larger tendency and were much more successful in organizing on the ground than Trotskyism was. And all of these groups collapsed for a variety of reasons and a variety of conflicting accounts, some of which I've discussed. So I guess really what we can say is that Trotskyism has survived as a larger tendency here in the West over time. And I think part of Trotskyism's permanence and appeal in the West is that it partially caters to the Cold War anti-communist propaganda that was endemic up to and after the fall of the Eastern Bloc. So whereas, as I mentioned, that ideology led myself and others to anarchism, on the other hand, it pushed people who wanted to maintain their Marxism and uphold the Bolshevik Revolution towards Trotskyism, or at least the Trotskyist discourse of Stalinism. You get this really easy out. You're like, well, that's all bad. Like anti-communist propaganda has taught us. So we have a way out of that because we got the Trotskyist discourse to say, well, that's because of Stalin, right? And that fits very well. That dovetails very well with a lot of anti-communist propaganda. And also, I think for some, it appeals to an idea of the proletariat that is Eurocentric, right? And here it's like we can't forget that Trotsky and most Trotskyists, I'm not saying all, but like the dominant ortho tradition, see the working classes in the imperialist metropoles as the most advanced, right? And Trotsky argued this even in the Second Congress and the Third International, this idea that the working class of the imperialist metropoles, because it was, that they were the most advanced proletariat and they would lead the world revolution and free the workers and peasants elsewhere, right? They were the ones that would be the spearhead of it. I mean, I know there are like unorthodox Trotskyists and post-Trotskyists who push against that doctrinaire position, but Trotskyism tends to be one of those Marxist tendencies that has its theoretical roots still buried within a Eurocentric understanding of social reality. And so people, I think, who live in, in a first world context where the labor aristocracy is predominant, this seems maybe unconsciously very likable to them, right? But more importantly to my mind is the fact that Trotskyists were successful in gaining entry to academia and thus setting the terms of the discourse regarding Marxism and what they saw as a correct apprehension of Marxism. So, most of the Marxists I encountered in academia, like my MA and PhD, were either Trotskyists or former Trotskyists. I don't mean the ones that were students, but I mean like the professors at that time and the other general people that were teaching. I mean, you get some people that were political Marxists, which were like through the Ellen Woods kind of tradition at York, but even they had an understanding of certain things that were inherited from kind of a Trotskyist analysis, even though they had differences as well. And the dominant tendency were people that kind of shared this Trotskyist discourse. So, and I did learn a lot from these scholars about Marxism in general, especially the classics. I mean, my MA supervisor, Jeff Noonan, he's a great guy and I like his work. He comes out, he's no longer, he defined himself as a Trotskyist, but he definitely came out of that tradition. Definitely it colors the way he sees the world. But, having learned all that and seen all that, I also discovered that there was this shared discourse about the history of worldwide revolution that had within it a general refusal to investigate things outside of that discourse, kind of almost a knee-jerk reaction. And that was treated as common sense almost. And I think it's important to kind of push against the way that the discourse has a certain amount of hegemony in academia. Although I think now maybe that hegemony is crumbling a bit amongst the academic Marxists.
Yeah, I think you make some good points there. Related to, I guess, this need to change our fundamental understanding of certain elements of Marxism and how we've historically received it. One of the key concepts of the general, at least historical Marxian analysis, is that of the party. This is one that I've thought a lot about as well. Going back to, say, the Agent Delta scandal, right? There was an interview conducted afterwards. I think it's like a panel. You can find the video on YouTube as a bunch of the other senior members of the SWP there. One of them, Neil Davidson, a very famous Scottish historian, they're all members of the SWP, trying to justify themselves of like why it was that they tried to disguise the scandal that had happened and the horrific abuses or the horrors that they were masking up collectively as an organization, and why they hadn't just kicked this person out. And the explanation that Neil Davidson gives on this like panel discussion is that because parties today tend to be so small, or at least to have such a small core of active militants, getting rid of one of those people means like obliterating almost the active component of your party. I mean, that's a horrible justification for what they did, no doubt. But it almost makes me think that there's some sort of deeper structural renovation that needs to be made with the concept of the party, because this division between like a small activist core whose integrity and personalities as members of the party need to be defended at all costs, even at the cost of apologia for sexual harassment. I wonder at times whether there's something in the concept of the party or the notion of the party as we've inherited it that's partly to blame for things like that. I know you talk a lot in The Communist Necessity about the need to renovate the concept of the party. I wonder if those concerns play any part in it.
Yeah. So yeah, in The Communist Necessity, I talk about rethinking the notion of the Communist Party, but I talk about it, rethinking it in relation. This is where I first, the polemic, I started using the term continuity and rupture there. I mean, it wasn't my term. It comes from the tradition, but that's where, for me, I started talking about it in my own work. And then, it's kind of The Communist Necessity is this kind of polemical introduction to continuity and rupture. But, I was talking about the need to rethink the idea of the Communist Party in continuity and rupture with how it's developed to date. And, unlike, say, someone like Badiou, who, thought, and others that thought the idea should be structured, well, should be not structured, should be trashed or abandoned altogether, but while maintaining some notion of organization and the importance of the communist hypothesis. So this description of me thinking about the party needs to be renovated, it was a polemic. So it was partially polemical because I was aware at the time that the necessity of rethinking the notion of the Communist Party was already happening. It's why I mentioned, the Communist Necessity being the introduction to continuity and rupture, but that's why it becomes a theme at the end of continuity and rupture. And also, while I've written about thinking the Revolutionary Vanguard Party of a new type a bunch, I'm also mindful, and this has always been one of my points, that what I think as an individual is less important than what is thought by living communist movements. So my thoughts on this matter, they were actually guided by insights gained from those revolutionary movements and these movements were generating, in my opinion, theoretical insights regarding the party concept that needed to be taken seriously. And I mentioned Badiou, right? So unlike Badiou, I wasn't interested in rethinking the notion of the Communist Party so as to abandon it in the way that he does. I mean, he has this idea of like organization without a party. My point was always what I use this a lot in The Communist Necessity. I would use the term a new return. Instead of like an old return, we just do the same mistakes over. It's like we kind of have this fresh return to the party concept. And that means like, how do we think the conception of the Revolutionary Communist Party in continuity and rupture in relation to what was established through the revolutionary successes of the past and the defeats and limits of those successes, right? So in Continuity and Rupture, I talked about Lenin's notion of the party vanguard and how it was an important theoretical development for revolutionary organizing, but how it met certain limits. What I saw as a particular dialectical contradiction instead of like a formal contradiction that is found conceptualized in Foundations of Leninism by Stalin, right? And that's the idea. Stalin is kind of like putting out the doctrinaire notion of fidelity to Lenin's concept of the party vanguard. He talks about the party as the general staff of the proletariat, right? And I want to point out here that it's easy to suddenly say this was Stalin's conception and not Lenin's, or that other people have it. But I think I want to point out that, this conception of the top-down general, it's not just something that comes from Stalin. It's not this aberration that allows you to very easily dismiss how commandism becomes ossified in traditional Marxist-Leninist parties or other kinds of traditional communist vanguard parties. It was, I think, this idea of the general staff of the proletariat that, Lenin talks about Stalin talks about was an accurate assessment of what Lenin's understanding of the party was based on the Bolshevik experience and what had been theorized in that direction. And this is a doctrinaire Trotskyist parties, you mentioned the SWP, things like that, and you talk about them all. A lot of them, they function according to the same principle of this general staff of the proletariat. They might call it something different, but it's this thing where leadership is completely protected and the vanguard forces themselves and party members are protected. Not that party members should be abandoned to everything, but I'm saying it's the idea of this complete shielding of them from the masses and from criticisms of the masses, which is why, as you point out, you get orthodox Trotskyist organizations such as the IMT, or you mentioned the SWP earlier, shielding their leadership from criticism of sexual assault and harassment. At the same time, other parties that that they may call Stalinist are doing the same thing, right? And I think it's because of this commandist notion of a top-down party that that there's a general staff and that the leadership is shielded and even other cadre are shielded, and that kind of like top-down method is something that allows problems in the party to ossify. But I mean, it's more than that. It's how do you think about how does a vanguard party become something that communicates with the masses, interrelates with them, and has a kind of conveyor belt of being trusted by the masses, absorbing them, and also taking direction from them and being a directing force when necessary. The Chinese Revolution, which is the focal point for the theoretical development of Maoism, brought certain theoretical insights to the proverbial table that altered the traditional notion of the vanguard party, right? The notion of the mass line, right? From the masses to the masses, right? Criticism and self-criticism, the theorization of line struggle that happens within the party itself. And that's why the Cultural Revolution, despite its limitations and eventual defeat, is an important site of theoretical innovation for those of us who locate ourselves in the Maoist tendency. Because it was that point in history where the masses were unleashed on the party leadership, and the idea that party hierarchy could be correct because of this notion of the general staff was thrown into question. Right, this idea of, and even people like Badiou, even though he goes away from the party concept, he still upholds some notion of a cultural revolution for this reason. He takes a different lesson from it. My lesson is that it tells us how a party can change, or things like that, or how a vanguard party formation can also have this connection to the masses in a way that is not like the doctrinaire general staff notion. So following the kind of the Cultural Revolution insights, there has been a variety of work in the contemporary Maoist movement about thinking the revolutionary vanguard party according to a mass politics. In a mass politics, it seeks to make leaders of all cadre and also keep the leadership in check by the masses and the cadre. And there's a bit of this. I mean, the PCP theorized the militarization of the party. I mean, I have my criticisms of some of that, but I think it's an easy small steps forward because it produces outside of the dogmatic way that it's maintained by some folks. What it is that when we treat it as a creative intervention, which it was, right, as opposed to another dogma or another formula, it's an interesting conception of how the party can blend with the army and the united front instead of keeping all these things fully separate. It's kind of this interesting notion of development and connection to the united front. Or we can talk about, in Nepal at its height before the revisionists took over in that party and just it kind of undermined the entire People's War, they had this really interesting notion of creating a practice of cultural revolution in all levels of the organization. You can look at some people like Isala Yami's interventions, also her interventions about the way that patriarchy ossifies in party structures and her suggestions of how to defeat that. Not that these were all implemented by them, but you get this kind of theoretical insights that started moving these organizations forward. I also am really indebted to Ajit Raleigh. His name is part of the Indian Revolution was Ajit, and he has a number of essays that were useful here. He wrote a really great one called "On the Maoist Party," and that criticizes all the kind of stuff around cults of personality and things like that, and also looks at the importance of like the mass line. And also he wrote the Vanguard in the 21st Century, a more recent piece that he wrote too. And those essays were about how to build a vanguard party that embeds itself in the masses and takes direction from the masses. And then adding to that, there's so many essays and analyses by the Communist Party of the Philippines, right, about mass work and the United Front and all that kind of stuff that shows you that it's very useful to show you how you take direction from the people you're trying to organize, and you don't come in, you don't parachute in as if you know everything, while understanding that you have a certain theoretical commitment, right? And how do you balance those sorts of things? I mean, one of the other things too that was always impressing me about, before it ended, but the PCP RCP experience in Canada was that, in the very beginning, that they had this notion that it's like, look, we are a party formation that seeks to be a vanguard, but we are not yet a vanguard. Because the idea was that to be a vanguard, you'd have to actually be leading revolution at like some early moment of People's War, or even before that you emerge as the force the masses take the most seriously. If you haven't done that, you're a party formation that is organizing to be a vanguard, but you are not the vanguard. And there's this kind of notion where all of these different Marxist parties put themselves forward. Oh, we are the vanguard party. We are the vanguard party. Like, that's fine. Compete amongst these different vanguard parties to see who organizes, but don't declare yourself the vanguard unless you actually have accomplished certain things and you're leading the revolution, as opposed to being a group of people organizing that most of the masses don't even know exists yet. In any case, I think the notion of the party is already being renovated by these different interventions.
There's a group over here in the UK that I'm also quite a fan of called CWO, the Communist Workers Organization. They're the national branch of the ICT, the Internationalist Communist Tendency. In Canada, that's Class Patalo.
Okay.
And I quite like the approach that they take on this. They say, we're not the vanguard party. They see themselves as sort of almost a precursor to the vanguard party. They don't think they're going to have any formal relation to the vanguard party once it's formed by the masses, apart from maybe having militated around it a little bit beforehand.
Yeah, well, I mean, this brings this is a long-standing debate about pre-party formations and the party formation. And I think the position that my organizational circles took is that you're still a party formation if you're organizing, and you should organize as a party formation with democratic centralism, of course, with mass line and all these kinds of things. And you should seek to become the vanguard, but just be ready that you may not become that, rather than being, well, we're this pre-party formation. Because one of the things that happens when we're organizing, but won't be the vanguard, it'll be something else, is you end up falling prey to kind of a spontaneity. Like you're not really trying to build the party. You're trying to say, well, the masses will build it, and something like that. And you can keep setting these kind of moving the goalposts further and further just to get on with your work. I mean, I think the idea of saying, okay, we're party formation, but we may not be the vanguard, but we're going to try to become that. And we're going to organize with a theoretical unity and democratic centralism kind of gives an organization a strength, at least in my opinion. That's kind of, I've seen it from these debates. And I have friends and fellow organizers that fall down on the other side of the debate too. We go back and forth and around in circles on this. And maybe at some point it's a semantic game, right? But maybe. In philosophy, we really care about like these kind of concepts.
Well, along those lines then, I think we're nearing the hour mark. So why don't we end this on a fun one? You talk a lot about a lot of different theorists in your books. Like you've mentioned already, Badiou and Deleuze and Guattari, as well as Bachelet. Let's talk about Althusser. Do you think there's an epistemic break in Marx?
Look, I go back and forth on Althusser's claim about an epistemic break on Marx, right? It's something that I find interesting to consider, and sometimes, important to just, sometimes I'll say I believe in it just to piss certain people off, and other days I'll say I don't believe in it. So, on the one hand, the reason I go back and forth is because, like, on the one hand, I think it's clear that Marx's early work was more connected to Feuerbach's conception of humanism, and that he did part ways with this conception when he wrote Theses on Feuerbach. It's hard not to see that when you read Theses on Feuerbach and his earlier work and say, okay, he's kind of almost criticizing parts of his own work. And this part was really brought home strong to me because I taught a course once on Feuerbach. And that was mainly because I'd never fully read Feuerbach. And I was like, I got offered this course in special topics in 19th century continental philosophy. And part of it was you could choose a theme or you could choose a person. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to do Feuerbach mainly because I want to read him because I've never read him, so I could learn it, right? And also I did connect Feuerbach a bit to some Hegel and some Marx, right, to show to the students like how it functioned, right? But when you read Feuerbach like fully, and then you read the early Marx, you can totally see Feuerbach's fingerprints over the early Marx, right? So in some ways, he was settling accounts with that. And I had one of my professors in my doctorate who really bought into the epistemic break thing. And this is back when I didn't buy into it. Like I would always argue, this was Himani Banerjee, and I would always argue with her in class about that. And she was like, look, what happens if you ever become like this big theorist, and then someone goes back and finds your undergraduate, even graduate papers and publishes them and says, this is the real Josh. Would you like that? And I was like, okay, maybe these are earlier works of his that are intended to be published. That's like, that's worth taking into consideration. But so that's all the one hand about why you can almost buy there's a concept of the epistemic break. But on the other hand, it's hard to say that the break is that stark, right? You can see these themes, say it's a break that's completely divorced. You can see these themes in his early work that as much as he may have ejected a certain notion of Feuerbach or Hegelianism or Feuerbachian Hegelianism, which is also a critique of Hegelianism as well, as much as he might have ejected that, there are certain themes that maybe he's retranslated them, but they still show up in his early work. And I don't think you can just dismiss them by saying, well, we're reading later Marx into early Marx, right? Or that these weren't important insights, like, the stuff on alienation. Yeah, it may be getting rearticulated in a certain way once Feuerbachian categories are dropped and the notion of the alienation of species being through time is dropped. But it's not like the strong critique of commodification is not in those essays as well, right? So there is the break isn't like this stark epistemic break. So what I do is I tend at the end of the day default on Althusser's own comment, right, about this, where he cited Lenin and he said he was bending the stick too far to overcorrect it. And that is, he was making an extreme claim to combat the Marxist humanism that sought in his time to find an authentic Marx in the 1844 manuscripts.
Although, if I'm not mistaken, there's, I think, still something stronger to be said in defense of the epistemic break, or at least of some kind of break, maybe a political one instead of an epistemic one. I know Michael Heinrich is doing this massive biography of Marx, and the second volume of it is currently being translated. But one of the political themes that he hones in on is this political transition from the early Marx, who, according to him, at least up until maybe like 1844, was still some kind of like Enlightenment liberal, to him starting to formally adopt and formally espouse communism and socialism.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that too. But I still don't think that makes the break stark. It just shows that the work gets transformed. As I said, there's a lot of good reasons to say that there is a difference between the young Marx and the later Marx. And it shows that how organization and being politically organized makes a bigger difference to your work. I still think you can find themes from the early Marx and the later Marx, but yeah, they're transformed, and there's a lot that he's ejected. So there's some kind of break. But it's just not this kind of like harsh thing, right? I think but you could go say that with any thinker, right? That go through these kind of movements. So yeah, that's why I say I go back and forth on it. I think the political organizing is a really big thing. But even through his whole career, there's different kind of breaks in the way that he sees political organizing. I really like the Raoul Peck biopic of Marx and Engels, of course, even though it's called The Young Marx. And it's not really about the young Marx. It's about the young organizing Marx, right? Because it starts off in a period where he's already involved in like kind of anti-state activities and is involved in the general like anti-capitalist milieu. But at that time, that whole milieu is very Enlightenment too, right? It has that idea of, it's a utopian socialist, like general rights of all human beings, right? And then there's that scene where he has a break from a lot of those people when he writes Poverty of Philosophy. And I do that in the movie. They make it like this kind of almost this action montage of him and Engels like writing and editing.
Yeah.
Suddenly there's this book, right? But then you get that key moment when the Working Men's Association is transformed into the Communist Party, where Engels is basically rejects this notion of bourgeois humanism. He's like, all men are brothers. He's like, no, the proletariat and the bourgeois are not, right? And it's like this kind of idea that moves in the organization, that is kind of a break of maybe the general humanism of early Marx. Not that there wasn't something more radical to that general humanism than there was to other humanistic tendencies.
Sure. Well, like I said, I think we're just out of time. So is there anything that you want to say to our listeners before we finish off this interview? Any upcoming works you want to put a word out for? Or any inspirational messages for the future of the revolutionary movement?
Well, I don't know about inspirational messages. That's not for me to give. But in terms of upcoming works, and these are all just kind of glimmers, I have this long-standing project that I've been working on, economism, right? Economism and class struggle. It's been going through different, first of all, it was like, I took it before pandemic. It's a history of it. Before pandemic, I had submitted it to RLI, Rowman and Littlefield International, and the editor that was working there at the time, they were very key to get that one in. But since over pandemic, it got shelved. And then because the lockdown, because the lockdown happened, the whole company shuttered itself. And also that editor ended up quitting. And so it was at that point, I was like, it seemed that RLI suffered a lot of losses and was becoming much more leaner and wasn't able to take that many manuscripts. So they ended up like handing it over to Foreign Languages Press, because even though, RLI was more academic, this book had much more activist kind of feel to it. And actually Chris at FLP was like bugging me for this manuscript because he knew I had it. So they have it now, and and they're going to just help me edits, because it's one of those books that, like, since it was written over a period of years, and even though the theme is more universal, I kept giving like contemporary examples, but then every year it doesn't get published. The contemporary examples end up out of date. So it's kind of like revised. That's the one problem with political philosophy. Even though the themes you may talk about is universal, when you want to give concrete models, you're stuck in your own time. And after like a few years, that concrete model is like, most people won't even know what it is anymore. But another one that I'm working on, but I hasn't found a home yet. I haven't submitted it anywhere yet. And it's less one that I have to worry about concrete models. It's actually right at the beginning of pandemic, when I had all this time to write, I decided to revisit for the umpteenth time the concept of the subject. Right? Maybe you were talking about Althusser and all this kind of stuff, because it's one of those things in philosophy that becomes like a big deal, and all these people talk about it. But the reason I was revisiting it, and I was also revisiting it because because a lot of times people just use this term subject, and you can be thrown into this being, well, what does that mean, right? What's the historiography of it? And then, of course, it gets inherited from other traditions outside of philosophy, and people use it, subject, whatever. And then it has this, relationship to being, right? And so for me, to being and to like nature and things like that. So for me, I wanted to start just writing a small essay for myself, not to be published, to kind of like, to basically just make it clear what the history of the subject was, what its basic meaning was, its distinction and intersection with the concept of being and the older concepts of nature and essence, and just keep those things clear for me, because they often get conflated and moved around and seen as different. And it was more just a roadmap for myself because of the complications. And it's something, I've always been studying and looking at for years. But then that damn roadmap turned into a book-length manuscript because it ended up being a lot harder to create this kind of historiography. And I was like, oh, this is actually turning into a book project from something that was just going to be a helpful rubric for me that I thought was going to be 10 pages. And now it's like 150 pages. So I just kept adding to it over the things and doing that and starting to look at like, all these things about, providing, like, it wasn't even supposed to be, it was supposed to be the most rigorous definition of it. It was supposed to be, here's a layman's understanding. Here's like, when we talk about the subject, let's look at how it first appeared philosophically from Descartes onward, all the critiques of it, just like kind of giving a general, broad brushstroke. So anyone who's very unfamiliar with it could like just say, okay, here's the general trajectory of it. But then of course that got into me discussing its connection with ideology, the debates with Althusser, all the stuff with existentialism, critiques of, the critiques from kind of the Black radical tradition and the anti-colonial tradition, and then also how that bled into discussions of being, that kind of stuff. So it became its own monster, and I definitely want to like find a place to publish that. Obviously, I don't think it's not something FLP will be interested in because it's way in that kind of philosophy line. But yeah, I'll see what I can do with it in the future.
Maybe Zer0 books would be. I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like both of those books sound incredible, and I can't wait for your first one to come out with foreign language press so I can pick up a copy of it for myself.
Yeah, it'll probably be the earliest 2023 because they got like a lot to work on. So, but at least now it's not sitting in limbo like it was from the beginning of 2020 through the entire lockdown. Yeah.
Well, we didn't quite get through all the questions that I wanted to today. So maybe we'll have to have you on again, maybe in a couple months' time, to talk about your work and your criticisms of like Deleuze and Guattari and François Laruelle, because I think that's a really surprising and interesting commentary that you offer in Demarcation and Demystification. But until that time, thank you so much for speaking to us, Josh.
No, thanks for having me.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.